8 hours and 16 minutes in the morning. August 6th, 1945. At the Tokyo Communications Center, the operator noticed that the Hiroshima line was out. He switched the toggle switch to the backup channel. Silence. I tried to contact them through neighboring Osaka. Silence. At the same moment, at the main railway junction, the dispatcher lost contact with the telegraph. The southbound trains simply disappeared from the map. No one in Tokyo panicked. Panic requires awareness of the threat, and here there was only irritation. The generals at headquarters looked at the reports and were angry at the signalmen. The fact is that the Japanese radars were working, and that morning they spotted only 3 American planes over Hiroshima. In 1945, hundreds of B-29 bombers and thousands of tons of incendiary bombs were needed to destroy the city. It took hours, and the sky was black with planes. 3 planes couldn't do anything serious. The maximum is a targeted strike on the telephone exchange. That's exactly what the headquarters decided. The Americans have cut the cable. Again. But time passed. 1 hour, 2, 3. Not a single train left the million-plus city. Not a single call was received. Hiroshima, the most important military port and army supply base, has simply fallen out of reality. Strange, crazy rumors from the outskirts began to leak into the headquarters. Peasants dozens of kilometers away from the city spoke of a silent flash and a cloud covering the sky. The military waved them off, but it was no longer possible to ignore the complete radio silence of the entire region. The general staff officer was given an order. He had to take a plane, fly to Hiroshima, find the place where the connection was cut off, and punish those responsible for negligence. He lifted the plane into the air, confident that he would be back for dinner with a report on a technical malfunction. But what he saw 3 hours into the flight made him doubt his own sanity. The plane carrying the staff officer had been in the air for 3 hours. It was a clear, sunny day. Visibility was perfect. Green hills and the blue waters of the inland sea drifted past under the wing. Hiroshima was still 160 kilometers away. That is a huge distance. For comparison, it's like seeing smoke over New York while standing in Philadelphia. But the pilot suddenly flinched and pointed ahead. On the horizon, where the crisp coastline should have been, a giant pulsating column of smoke was rising. It didn't look like the aftermath of a standard raid. A standard raid leaves many pockets of fire. Here, the air itself was burning. The officer ordered a descent. As they got closer, their confusion turned into something for which they had no words. They knew the map of Hiroshima by heart. Here should be Hiroshima Castle, an ancient fortress. Here, Ujina Port. Here, the dense wooden housing of the residential districts. But when the plane reached the city, maps became useless. There were no landmarks. Instead of a city, a giant, flat, crimson stain lay below. It was still boiling. The fire was so intense that the plane was tossed around by updrafts of hot air. The major looked out the window, trying to find even one standing building, but he saw only ash and strange, unnatural shadows on the ground. They circled over the city, unable to believe their eyes. They were looking for bomb craters, signs of carpet bombing. Usually, after a raid by hundreds of B-29s, the ground looks like a lunar landscape, pitted with holes. But here, the ground was flat, as if a giant hand had simply erased all structures with an eraser. The officer grabbed the radio. His voice trembled as he transmitted the first confirmed message to Tokyo. The phrase he spoke entered history for its brevity and horror. The whole city of Hiroshima was destroyed instantly by a single bomb. Fires are continuing. This message dropped onto desks in Tokyo like a stone. The reaction of the high command was predictable for men who do not want to admit defeat. They said, "That cannot be." The deputy chief of the general staff, General Kawabe, read the report and tossed it aside. He was sure. The officer is panicking. The officer is exaggerating. Destroyed instantly? By a single bomb? That is the raving of a madman. The military began to construct their theories. They decided the Americans had used some new, particularly powerful incendiary mixture. Or perhaps it was a massive sabotage at the ammunition depots that detonated simultaneously with a raid. They clung to any version except the truth, because the truth meant not just the loss of a city. The truth meant that their entire defense strategy, all their plans for the decisive battle on the shores of Japan, were now not worth the paper they were written on. But among the generals, there were men who began to suspect something. They remembered rumors from scientific laboratories, rumors of a super weapon that could split matter. However, they chased even this thought away, and they had, as they believed, an ironclad scientific reason for doing so. There is a popular myth that for the Japanese high command, the atomic bomb was something like magic or alien technology, that they simply didn't understand what hit them because they were backward. That is a lie. The truth is much more interesting and tragic. Japan knew perfectly well what a nuclear weapon was. Moreover, they had their own atomic program. It was called Project Ni, named after its leader, Dr. Yoshio Nishina. Japanese physicists were some of the best in the world. They understood the theory just as well as Oppenheimer or Einstein, and it was this knowledge that doomed them. Years before Hiroshima, Japanese scientists ran the calculations. They came to a conclusion. To create one atomic bomb, you need a colossal amount of uranium ore and as much electricity as all of Tokyo consumes in several months. They looked at their resources and told the army, "It is impossible. We don't have that much uranium, and we don't have that kind of power." The project was shelved, deemed a dead end. But then they took the next logical step, which became fatal. They thought, if this is impossible for us, the great empire, and if even the genius German engineers couldn't do it, then the Americans definitely can't. They knew the US was rich, but they couldn't imagine the scale of the Manhattan Project. They couldn't imagine that America would build entire secret cities, factories the size of automotive plants, just to refine a few kilograms of isotope. So, when the report, "the whole city destroyed by one bomb," arrived in Tokyo, the generals engaged their logic. "Is it an atomic bomb?" someone asked. "No," the experts replied. "The Americans would need at least another 5 years to create it. It's science fiction." The military seized on this explanation. It was more comfortable to believe in a massive raid by conventional aircraft that the radars missed than to admit the enemy possessed a doomsday weapon. Heated arguments broke out in the offices of the general staff. Some demanded a scientific expedition be sent immediately. Others shouted that this was defeatism and air defenses simply needed to be strengthened. Minister of the Army Anami, a man of iron will and fanatical loyalty, stated that even if the Americans had such a bomb, it was surely the only one, an experimental prototype, a one-off. They convinced themselves. They created a cozy cocoon of denial in which the war was still being fought by the old rules. In this cocoon, one could plan defenses, draw front lines, and prepare suicide soldiers. But this cocoon was not torn open by scientists or spies. Morning came on August 7th. Almost 24 hours had passed since the destruction of Hiroshima. In Tokyo, they still didn't understand the scale of the catastrophe. The official version remained vague. Strong raid. New type of bombs. The irony of fate is that the Japanese government learned the truth not from their generals, not from spies, and not from scientists. They learned the truth from a radio broadcast intended for American housewives. Monitoring services recorded a broadcast from the White House. President Harry Truman issued a statement that changed the world forever. Translators in Tokyo listened to the recording, their faces draining of color with every word. Truman didn't use codes. He spoke directly and brutally. 16 hours ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. It is an atomic bomb. We have spent $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we won. The word atomic rang out like a gunshot in the quiet office. For the Japanese high command, this was absolute humiliation. Imagine their state of mind. They were sitting there arguing about incendiary mixtures, and the enemy declares openly to the whole world that they have harnessed the energy of the universe. Truman continued, and his next promise sounded like a biblical prophecy. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. The reaction in Tokyo was split. The politicians were terrified. They realized the war was lost. If America has a weapon capable of erasing cities with a snap of fingers, resistance loses all meaning. But the military reacted differently. A psychological defense mechanism kicked in. An army spokesman stated, "It's a bluff. It's American propaganda. Truman is just scaring us to make us surrender. An atomic bomb is technically impossible. We checked." They grasped at straws. They said, even if it is an atomic bomb, they only have one. They couldn't have made more. It was a critical moment. If they had believed Truman immediately, perhaps Nagasaki could have been saved. But pride did not allow them to admit that the enemy had surpassed them, not just in soldier count, but intellectually. They needed proof. Not the words of an enemy president, but scientific fact. And in Japan, there was only one man whose authority could outweigh the stubbornness of the generals. The government urgently summoned Dr. Yoshio Nishina, the father of Japanese nuclear physics. They put him on a plane and sent him to Hiroshima with one question: is what Truman said true? What he found at the site of the city left no room for doubt. Dr. Yoshio Nishina arrived in Hiroshima on August 8th. By that time, the city was still smoldering. Nishina wasn't just a scientist. He was the man who understood matter better than anyone else in Japan. When he stepped onto the scorched earth, he looked at the destruction not as a soldier, but as a physicist. The military looked for craters. Nishina looked for traces of heat. He approached the ruins of what was once a house. He picked up a piece of roof tile from the ground. It wasn't just broken. It had boiled. The top layer of clay had turned into a glass-like mass. Nishina knew, to melt ceramic like this, you need a temperature above 2,000 degrees Celsius. Instantly. No conventional bomb, no napalm produces such heat in a split second. Then he saw the shadows. On the surviving walls and on the asphalt, dark silhouettes of bridge railings, poles, even people remained. The light from the explosion was so bright and hot that it instantly bleached the color around objects, leaving a pristine shadow behind them. It was the effect of a photographic flash, only with the power of 1,000 suns. For Nishina, the puzzle came together instantly. He didn't need Geiger counters to understand the essence. He turned to the accompanying officers and said what he had feared to say all his life. This is it. It is a uranium bomb. He sent an urgent report to Tokyo. Now it was the official conclusion of science. Truman was not bluffing. America had indeed used a nuclear weapon. It would seem that after such a verdict, the war should end immediately. But you underestimate the stubbornness of the Imperial Army. When Nishina's report landed on the General Staff's table, the generals performed an incredible mental somersault. They moved from the stage of denial of existence to the stage of denial of quantity. The general's logic was frighteningly cynical. Okay, let's say they have an atomic bomb, but mining uranium is an insanely difficult process. We know this from our own experiments. That means the Americans had only one such bomb. They dropped it on Hiroshima to scare us. They don't have any more. They began to convince the government. We have nothing to fear. The worst is over. We survived the blow. Now we must rally and continue preparing for the invasion. Admiral Toyota, head of the Navy, stated, "Even if they have another one or two, we can survive these losses, but we will not surrender." Imagine this level of fanaticism. They were ready to accept the destruction of another one or two cities as acceptable losses. They were betting that the U.S. arsenal was empty. It was Russian roulette, where the lives of millions of Japanese were at stake, and the generals pulled the trigger. August 9th, 1945, 10:30 in the morning. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, in a concrete bunker, the Supreme War Council gathered, the so-called Big Six. These 6 men effectively ruled Japan. The Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of War, and the Chiefs of Staff. The atmosphere in the bunker was suffocating. The ventilation was working poorly. The heat was terrible, and the air was blue with cigarette smoke. Opinions were split exactly down the middle. 3 against 3. On one side of the table sat the Peace Party, led by Foreign Minister Togo. They understood. The game is over. Hiroshima showed that resistance is meaningless. They proposed accepting the Potsdam Declaration and surrendering, with the sole condition to preserve the life of the emperor. On the other side sat the War Party. Its leader was General Anami. Anami was not a fool. He was a samurai of the old school. For him, surrender was worse than death. His argument was simple and terrifying. The Americans had only one atomic bomb. They have no more. If we force them to land on our beaches, we will give them such a bloodbath that they will sue for peace on our terms. Anami demanded 4 conditions. Preservation of the emperor. No occupation of Japan. Japan will disarm its own troops. Japan will try its own war criminals. These were insane demands for a losing side, but Anami was adamant. The argument reached a deadlock. Generals shouted at each other, slammed their fists on the table. It seemed a decision would never be reached. And then the bunker door opened. An aide entered the room. He looked pale. He walked to the head of the table, bowed silently, and placed a narrow strip of telegraph paper before the Prime Minister. Prime Minister Suzuki read the message. He slowly raised his eyes to the generals and spoke in a quiet voice. The city of Nagasaki is destroyed. A new type of bomb. Silence hung in the room. In that moment, General Anami's entire defense collapsed. His theory of a single specimen crumbled to dust. If the Americans dropped a second bomb just 3 days after the first, it means this is not an experiment. This is an assembly line. This is production. It means the next bomb could fall on Tokyo tonight. It would seem now the argument is over. Now the war party must admit defeat. And here happens the most incomprehensible event of that day. General Anami stood up, adjusted his uniform, and said, "This changes nothing. We must still fight." You heard that right. Even after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even knowing that cities were vanishing one by one, the Big Six voted again. Result: 3 votes for surrender, 3 votes to continue the war down to the last Japanese. It was total paralysis of power. The system broke. By law, the decision had to be unanimous, but there was no unanimity. Time was running out. Every hour of delay could cost the lives of another 100,000 people. Prime Minister Suzuki, an old and tired man, realized they had only one way out left, a way that had never been used in the modern history of Japan. They needed to summon the one who never spoke, the one whose voice mere mortals had no right to hear. It was 11:50 p.m. August 9th was ending. In the stifling bunker, the Imperial Conference had been going on for hours. The air conditioners had failed. The highest ranks of the empire sat in their dress uniforms, drenched in sweat. Arguments had run out. Words had run out. The deadlock was total. Then Prime Minister Suzuki rose from his seat. He took a step toward Emperor Hirohito, who had been sitting on a small dais all this time, silent and motionless as a statue. Suzuki did the unthinkable. He bowed and said, "Your Majesty, we have been unable to reach an agreement. Now, we ask your majesty to make the decision. We will follow your will, whatever it may be. Dead silence fell over the hall. Everyone froze. To understand the context, by Japanese tradition, the emperor does not interfere in politics. He reigns, but does not rule. His word is law, but he never speaks it first. He only approves the decisions of ministers. Asking him to pick a side in a dispute is a violation of all protocols. It is an admission of the government's total bankruptcy. Hirohito slowly stood up. He was small in stature, wearing glasses, looking tired, and nothing like a formidable warlord. He began to speak. In Japan, the emperor's voice was called the voice of the sacred crane, a sound that descends from the heavens. He spoke quietly, without pathos. I have given serious thought to the situation. I have decided that the war must be ended. The generals flinched. Hirohito continued, and his words were a harsh verdict on the military leadership. I was told that the defenses would be strong, but the plans you showed me are at odds with reality. If we continue to fight, it will result not only in the collapse of Japan, but in the destruction of human civilization. He mentioned a new and most cruel bomb. He understood that against atomic weapons, the samurai spirit had no chance. Then he uttered a phrase that would become legendary. The time has come to endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable. When he finished, something incredible happened in the bunker. Iron generals, men who sent thousands of soldiers to death without hesitation, began to weep. They fell to their knees, buried their faces in the floor, and sobbed aloud. Not out of fear of death, but out of shame. They had failed their God. They had forced him to humble himself and beg for peace. General Anami, the chief proponent of war, cried loudest of all. For him, this was the end of the world. His emperor had ordered surrender. As a loyal servant, he had to obey. But as a warrior, he could not live with it. The decision was made. Japan accepts the Potsdam Declaration. The war is over. It would seem this is where we cut to black. Roll credits. But history is rarely that simple. While the old generals in the bunker were wiping their tears, in the corridors of the Ministry of War, young officers were already loading their pistols. They learned of the emperor's decision, and they decided that the emperor was mistaken, or that he had been deceived by traitorous politicians. On the night of August 14th to 15th, Tokyo plunged into chaos. While the emperor slept, confident that his decision was being implemented, a group of young officers from the Ministry of War decided to rewrite history. Their leader was Major Kenji Hatanaka. He was only 33 years old. In his head, an insane but strictly logical picture had formed. The emperor is a god. A god cannot make mistakes. Therefore, the decision to surrender was imposed by traitors in the government. The duty of a loyal soldier is to liberate the emperor from bad advisors and destroy the treacherous recording of the peace speech. The plan was simple. Seize the imperial palace, isolate the emperor, and force him to cancel the order. Around midnight, the conspirators burst into the office of the commander of the Imperial Guard, General Mori. They demanded he join the coup. Mori refused. The conversation was short. A flash of steel, a gunshot, and General Mori fell silent forever. Hatanaka used the dead general's seal to forge Strategic Order Number 584. With this forgery in hand, the rebels took control of the guard. The soldiers, suspecting nothing, took up positions around the palace. They cut the telephone cables. The palace's connection to the outside world was severed. Inside the residence, panic began. Servants and chamberlains ran through dark corridors, locking doors and barricading entrances with furniture. But the main target of the rebels was not the throne room. They were looking for the Gyokuan Hoso, 2 vinyl records on which the emperor had recorded his address to the people an hour earlier. If Hatanaka finds the records and smashes them, there will be silence on the air in the morning. The war will continue. The Americans will drop a third bomb, then a fourth. Chamberlain Tokugawa managed to hide the records at the last moment. He couldn't find a safe. In a panic, he simply shoved them into a small niche in the wall of an office and piled old documents and rations in front of it. The rebels burst into the room. They overturned tables, ripped up tatami mats with bayonets, dumped out drawers. Hatanaka was furious. He knew the recording was somewhere here. He was standing literally half a meter from it, but a pile of boring papers in the corner didn't catch his eye. Time was working against them. Dawn was approaching. Hatanaka realized, as soon as the sun rises, the deception with the forged order will be revealed. He needed to seize the NHK radio station. He sped there on a bicycle, a surreal image for a coup leader. He burst into the studio, waving a pistol, and demanded airtime. He wanted to address the nation himself, to call the people to uprising. But the radio technicians showed amazing courage. They cut the microphones. They sabotaged the equipment. Hatanaka screamed into the void. At that time, General Tanaka, commander of the Eastern District Army, arrived at the palace. He did not support the coup. He came to restore order. Seeing a real general, the soldiers of the guard realized they had been deceived. The coup collapsed like a house of cards. By 8 a.m., it was all over. Major Hatanaka, realizing he had lost, walked out onto the plaza in front of the palace. He took out leaflets with his demands, scattered them around him, and committed ritual suicide. It was the last gunshot of World War II. The records were saved. Radio station employees carefully packed them and drove them to the studio. While the rebellion was being suppressed at the palace, silence reigned at the official residence of the Minister of War. General Anami Korichika was preparing for his final sunrise. Anami was a complex figure. He was the face of the war. He demanded the decisive battle. He argued with the emperor to the last breath. But when the rebels came to him asking for support, he refused. Why? Because his loyalty to the emperor was absolute. The emperor ordered to lay down arms. As a soldier, Anami obeyed. But as a samurai, he could not survive this shame. In his understanding of the world, surrender was a stain that could only be washed away with one's own life. Early on the morning of August 15th, the general put on a white shirt. It wasn't just clothing. This shirt had been given to him by Emperor Hirohito himself when Anami was his aide-de-camp. By wearing it, he was symbolically stating, "I leave as a loyal servant." He walked out onto the veranda of his house. It offered a view toward the imperial palace. Below, in the garden, cicadas were singing. The air was fresh after the night rain. Anami sat on the tatami. He took a brush and paper to write a farewell poem, a haiku. It is an ancient tradition. A warrior must meet death with beauty in his heart. He wrote, "Having received great favors from the emperor, I have nothing to say at the moment of death." But then he added another note, in prose. And it is this note that historians debate to this day. He wrote, "With my death, I humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime." What crime was he talking about? That he lost the war? That he allowed rebels to cause chaos that night? Or that he dared to argue with a living god in the bunker? We will never know. Anami committed seppuku. He did it following all the rules of the old code, with chilling calm. He did not rush. He wanted to feel life fading, considering it his punishment. When officers came to him in the morning, they found his body covered with his uniform, bearing all his medals. Next to him lay a photograph of his son, who had died at the front in China. Anami's death was a signal. If the country's chief Hawk, the man who wanted to fight tanks with spears, decided to leave, it meant the war was truly over. The army had lost its head. Now, no one dared to object to the emperor's will. The sun rose over Tokyo. The clock struck noon. Millions of Japanese, from soldiers in the Manchurian steppes to housewives in the ruins of Osaka, gathered around radios. They were told that something unheard of was about to happen. At exactly noon on August 15th, radios across Japan came to life. First, the national anthem Kimi ga Yo played. Then, a pause. And finally, a voice. This voice sounded strange. It was high-pitched, slightly creaky, and used archaic, courtly language that ordinary Japanese could barely understand. But they didn't need to understand every word. The intonation spoke for itself. The emperor never once used the word surrender. He said that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He said that the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. But the essence was clear. The divine empire had lost. People in the streets fell to their knees. They wept. Some from grief, some from relief. Because for the first time in years, they knew. Tomorrow, their homes would not be bombed. Tomorrow, their sons would not charge into attack with bamboo spears. In that moment, deep in the bunker beneath the palace, the remaining members of the High Command sat in silence. Their war was over, but their tragedy was just beginning. The story of the Japanese High Command's reaction to Hiroshima is not just a military chronicle. It is a lesson on the nature of power and the human psyche. For 9 long days, from August 6th to August 15th, the fate of a nation hung by a thread, not because of a lack of information, but because of a refusal to accept it. See you at the next video.